Hello and welcome to this game review. It's a game played by Magnus in January of 2025, and it features the Cowboy attack. So what is this opening? Let's take a look at this game. It was a 3-minute blitz game with 1 second increment, and Carlson had the white pieces. He plays against looks like Goldona Karamova, if I pronounced that correctly. And this game was played, let's see, I don't know if there's a location, no location, so maybe it was played online. All right, if we look at the accuracy rating, now of course Magnus Carlsen wins. He played a 93% accuracy rating versus 82 by his opponent. And you see how he slowly builds his advantage, until the lead gets bigger and bigger till he wins. And he only had 2 inaccuracies and 1 mistake. His opponent had 5 inaccuracies and 4 mistakes. And Magnus played at a 3150 rating level in this game versus 2700 by his opponent. So let's look at the Cowboy attack. Begins with E4 by Magnus Carlsen, and his opponent responds with C5. So we have a Sicilian defense. And, the normal theme in that, once you play E4, the opponent counterattacks with a flank pawn covering this D4 square. So often, white will play knight to F3 to help guard that D4 square and allow you to push the pawn so that if it's captured, the knight can capture in the center instead of the queen, which could be chased away by a knight. All right, back to the Cowboy attack. So basically this is it. You play B3 as the second move. Now, it does look like, once the bishop fianchetto's here, you have this great bishop lined up through the center aiming towards the king side, and black often castles to the king side as he's already pushed a pawn over here on the queen side. And also the bishop could help cover that D4 square there. So the game continues with a normal developing move. This is a book move, developing the knight here and attacking the unprotected pawn. So normally you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening, but Magnus does push that pawn again because he has good reason. Now you're chasing a knight and the opponent has to waste time running here. So where will this knight go? It goes to the center. And now, I guess you could even attack that knight again, but then you might create a weakness with this backwards D pawn. So instead, Magnus just continues with his development. He brings the bishop here onto the long diagonal towards the king side. And so the game continues with E6, the first inaccuracy of the game. Apparently G6 is preferred, which would help get you castled more quickly. And then I guess you could have an option of pushing the C pawn, and then maybe if it's captured, probably the bishop would recapture maybe. But in the game, we have knight developing, and because this player is quite a bit lower rated than Magnus, I think they're rated 2500 and something, and Magnus was 3200 rated in these blitz games. We have an exchange of material, and it looks like that's the best move according to the computer. But at this point, white has a slight edge, and after this recapture, which is best, it looks like, you doubled your pawns up, kind of messing up the pawn structure. You're blocking this bishop, but the queen is kind of activated. You have a open file here, which could be used to white's, or a half open file, which could be used in the future, perhaps. And also it might discourage possibly this pawn push in the future. I guess you could move there now, and then if pawn captures, bishop or queen could capture. But let's see what happens here. So the pawn is pushed to D5, and this is a common theme in the Sicilian defense. is trying to get your D pawn up to D5 to give black more space in the Sicilian defense. But apparently here the computer states that it's an inaccuracy, not a losing inaccuracy, but the computer preferred just developing a piece here. And so after this move, we have the en passant capture, and that is the best move according to the computer. So then we have a recapture with the queen, getting the queen out towards the center, but not so far where it could be attacked, and perhaps asking Magnus if he would like to exchange queens. But if Magnus captured here, it would just help this bishop develop after it recaptured. So instead, Magnus just develops a knight. And now the computer says that this is a mistake, that developing that knight is a mistake, and that white has pretty much given up most of the advantage, that bishop to d3 would have been better, maybe avoiding a queen trade, because apparently now the best move is to go ahead and capture with the queen. But normally that is done by some lower rated players that figure, oh, I'm playing Magnus, if I trade off pieces it'll get closer to a draw or avoid a loss. But perhaps black wanted to keep their queen, and so we have a knight developing move. And now this is an inaccuracy. Apparently queens should have been traded. But also look at this pawn here, which prevents that knight from moving forward. So that knight is really limited. I mean, I guess the knight could try and go here and attack, but that's not even, well, I guess it is possible, because if the knight moved to e5 attacking, well then even if the queens were traded, the bishop could guard that knight. But there's also, with the knight here, a possibility of capturing with a check. But the game continues with the queen developing up here to e2. And now there's a possible threat of rook to d1 attacking the queen. So the game continues with a6. And what is the point behind this move? Well, maybe to keep the queen from going to b5. Also preparing to push here and get some kind of activity over on the queen side. Now we have g3, getting ready to fianchetto, and then Magnus will be able to get his king to safety by castling kingside. The game continues with f6, a mistake by Karamova here. So, what should have been played? Bishop to d7, a developing move. Now, why was this move played? Maybe to blunt the scope of this bishop in the future, to keep the knight from being able to press forward, perhaps. So we have bishop fianchettoing. Magnus is ready to castle, and the game continues with bishop developing for black, and now black is ready to castle kingside. So we have a repositioning of the knight by Magnus. So here, what does this move do? Well, it has multiple purposes. One, the knight could possibly jump up here, attacking the queen, chasing it away. But now it blocks the path of the queen that was preventing Magnus from castling to the queen side. So now that's a possibility. So we have castling kingside by black, and Magnus chooses to castle queenside, leaving an opposite side castling game. And when you have that, it's usually a race. You want to throw the pawns forward on each side of the board. So black will try and throw his pawns forward on the queen side, and white will start storming the pawns forward on the king side. And often whoever gets their attack in first will have the advantage. So now we have queen getting out, off of the d file, the potential line of fire discovered attack on the queen if that knight were to move away. So Magnus just completes his development here. And if we take a look at this, this is pretty crazy. Magnus has all of his pieces developed here, and his opponent still has not developed a rook on the queen side or this bishop, which is trapped in by its pawns on the same color squares. So we have b5, and the pawn storm begins. So Magnus's opponent throws his pawns forward, gaining space on the queen side, and perhaps preparing a future attack towards Magnus's king. And the game continues here with c4. An inaccuracy, according to the computer, f4 was preferred, but what does this move do? Well, perhaps it tries to get rid of one of the doubled pawns. Now there's a threat of capturing here. Then if you have recapture, the queen could capture. Although black could attack and capture here, maybe opening up some threats. The Magnus probably won't exchange over here, because that would just open lines of attack towards his king. So now we have the push, pawn push here. There is a possible outpost and an attack on the queen here, possible. Space is gained here, and now this pawn is free to just start pushing up the board and trying to open up an attack. Magnus continues with a counterattack of his own, throwing the first pawn forward in his pawn storm on the king side. f4, an inaccuracy according to the computer. Queen to e3, just bringing the queen up, centralizing a little bit better, is preferred by the computer. Perhaps because then you could have the knight jumping forward, it would be captured, pawn captures, and if the queen was on e3, it could gain a pawn. So that would prevent the knight from jumping forward here. Although, if that knight comes forward now, bishop could capture, pawn could capture, and then the rook would be taken over here. So we have rook to b8, preventing that possibility. But this is a mistake. Apparently that should have all been ignored, and a5 should have been played, starting to push forward and try and get that pawn storm moving. So Magnus repositions his bishop now that it's not really doing much. It wasn't, it was lined up on the rook, but no longer. So now we have pressure building up on this pawn, 3 attackers and only 1 defender. And Magnus is just ahead by over a pawn equivalent advantage. So the game continues with a5, a mistake. Apparently knight up here to d8 would have been better, helping to guard this pawn. So the game continues with bishop capturing by Magnus and a check. So we have exchange of bishops. The queen recaptures with check, and now the king retreats to the corner. So Magnus continues the game with a knight developing move. He kind of brings the knight forward. It helps guard this potential outpost here, and perhaps the knight can storm forward and help attack the king in the future. So we have rook to the center, and Magnus ignores that, repositioning his knight, and now there could be a threat of jumping forward here and applying pressure to this bishop, perhaps. After an exchange of rooks, Magnus is left with a rook on the open file, so his opponent fights for that open file, countering Magnus's rook, and after another exchange, the knight drops back with an attack on the queen. So what will Magnus do next? Well, Magnus continues with a retreat, but keeping that queen centralized here. It also maybe keeps an eye on that square in case the knight would want to reposition in that direction. But I don't see that likely. Probably the knight will just go back to where it was. Oh, and also from here, there could be a potential back rank checkmate if black is not careful. So the queen counters Magnus's queen by asking the question, do you want to trade queens off? What does Magnus do? Well, he ignores that in favor of improving his knight's position. Now there's an attack here. So the threat not only to the queen, but the bishop is being attacked as well. Will the opponent trade and give Magnus a passed pawn in the center? No. We have a queen retreat, and now Magnus, does not get rid of the bishop with his knight, which would leave Magnus with a dark squared bishop versus this horrible knight in the back here. And so, usually with pawns on both sides of the board, that would favor the bishop. Instead, Magnus just pushes forward here, gaining space, trying to lock things down over here. And I guess en passant capture was possible, but then that would just potentially allow the bishop to move up here, putting pressure on this pawn, although it is guarded at the moment. But, if that knight were to capture, then all of a sudden you'd have two attackers on that pawn, queen and bishop. So instead, we have h6, just giving the black monarch a little escape hatch in case he needs it. And the game continues with Magnus pulling his king over to the side. Perhaps, why is this move played? I mean, I guess the king could end up moving up here where it's protected and cannot be captured. But, this is a 3-minute game. Magnus still has 1:36 left on his clock, and his opponent must be moving pretty fast with only 2 minutes. Or excuse me, 2 minutes, which is more than Magnus. All right, the bishop drops back, covering, these two diagonals where the knight could potentially try to go, but that's all covered for now. So the game continues with Magnus gaining space on the king side. The knight repositions here, and now we have Magnus gaining even more space with h5 and restricting the pawn here. And also the king, if it moves forward, it would not be able to move out, unless this pawn is pushed forward and the h pawn would be exchanged off. So knight moves forward, attacking Magnus's knight. Will we have a further exchange of pieces by Magnus? No, he drops back, and now there's a threat of knight check, forking king, and unprotected bishop. But that would be very dangerous if we notice the queen is preventing that king from moving over to protect. So we have queen countering Magnus's queen, preventing, or I guess covering that diagonal. So here, Magnus jumps the knight forward onto this fine outpost, attacking the king. And, what next here? Well, it looks like the king steps forward, and I'm thinking some pieces will be exchanged here. So let's see how the game plays out here in the end. We have queen capturing, placing a discovered attack on the queen, but of course the knight could always pick that off. So if this knight moves, it's not really a threat because Magnus's knight is covering that bishop. All right. Queen moves up here to help protect the knight, and Magnus has the edge now. So we have another pawn being lost. The knight steps forward, perhaps with an intention of moving here, although the bishop could just capture that. So queen moves up. Magnus is threatening to capture here and then deliver a mate. So the game continues with a check, the best move in the position. King up to a2, also the best move. And now we have the queen helping guard the bishop that's under fire by knight and queen. the game continues with a capture and recapture here. So what will Magnus do next? He could just go ahead and exchange off the queens, but the question is, will this pawn be able to run in the endgame? So let's find out what Magnus does. No, he centralizes his queen with a check. Oh, and it's also a fork, grabbing the knight here. So now his opponent is pretty much a goner at this point. So we have the knight leaving the board, and well, now there's the option to capture this. I don't know if his opponent just got rattled under the attack. I mean, he still has 40 seconds left. But, you know, if I had 40 seconds, I would be crumbling because I'm not the greatest time player. So we have a check, block, and now the queens will surely be exchanged. And so we go into the end game. That pawn is running up the board, and the bishop will protect the pawn if it moves forward. So it's looking pretty grim here. Magnus just repositioning, or sorry, pushing his pawns forward, preventing any counterplay, and you know, now he's just going to slowly win here. So we can watch the finale and see how Magnus ended up winning the game. The pawns are storming up, and it will lead to a, you know, checkmate possibility. So the final move, we have a check, and what can be done here? If the king goes into the corner, well, then it's a mate here by this pawn because the bishop is protecting that. If the king goes here, well, then the pawn will promote to a queen or rook and deliver the checkmate because these pawns are preventing the king from moving forward. So interesting game there, a blitz game, you know, 3-minute game. The Sicilian defense cowboy attack variation. So I don't know, what do you think? Leave comments if you feel like it. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.